everyone. I think we are about to start. I have a great pleasure to moderate the last academic session today. My name is Nina Baranowska, and I'm a postdoc at Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. And I'm currently doing research as a team member of FINDHR project, which is funded by Horizon Europe, and we are focusing on developing non-discriminatory AI system in the recruitment process. I'm very lucky today to be surrounded by great speakers. We have Emmanouil Bougiakiotis from European University Institute, Merel Noorman from Tilburg University, Balsa from Cornell Tech, and this speaker will bring us more into the discussion on theoretical frameworks on regulating data protection, AI, and privacy risk assessment. And at the end of this session, we will have great pleasure to listen to the presentation of Asuman Senol. She's the first author of a winning paper of CNIL INRIA Privacy Protection Award. Just a quick remark about the format of this session, because it's slightly different from the regular panels at CPDP. This is academic panel, and I will briefly introduce speakers at the beginning. Then each speaker will get around 12 minutes to present their paper, and this will be followed by the Q&A session with the audience to listen to your questions, remarks, any feedback. So I'm going to give a floor now to the first speaker. Emmanouil is a PhD researcher in law at the European University Institute in Florence. He works on collective approaches to data protection and governance, focusing on law, economics, and policy. And in the past, he worked in the public sector, including Greek Data Protection Authority and also the European Data Protection Board. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So, supposed to do it there, right? Well, thank you. Great, we have the slides. Okay, let me set my timer so that I don't talk too much. Right. Thank you very much, everyone. It's a great privilege to be here. And my talk today is going to be about the notion of control and whether we can meaningfully retain it by abolishing consent. And I know that sounds a bit weird, but I hope by the end of my presentation it will make a bit more sense. So control, generally, is a notion that is appealing both psychologically and politically. People like being in control, and for politicians, giving power to the people is a very powerful narrative. And also, it's ingrained in our legal and human rights culture. Most human rights rely on the exercise of those rights by individuals, and then we have institutions in place to assist them and enforce their rights, but the basic structure comes from the bottom, from the rights bearers. Now, in data protection, there is this, and in privacy, there is this familiar narrative that we have some problems with the exercise of control, which are that we have these long and incomprehensible notices. Sometimes I play a few video games with my friends, and sometimes, when you start the game, there's this huge notice, and just out of curiosity, I start scrolling. And I think it's interesting that they kind of look at me weirdly, and I think now there's even some social censure when you're trying to do that. You're seen as weird. And the second problem, we've had a lot of talk about this in this conference, is obviously dark patterns and how design can manipulate people and can deprive them of the opportunity to exercise control meaningfully. The third problem is that we simply have too many instances in which we have to decide. So even if we were to overcome the first two problems, we simply couldn't do it at scale. And I think the majority of the narrative about control in data protection law is that we have control as this lofty ideal that we want to achieve, and then we have these problems that we need to overcome. And the discussion is on whether we can overcome these problems and how to do so. And I will submit to you that this is a false or at least an incomplete narrative. The main problem with control is not whether we can overcome information asymmetries, it's something much more problematic. And that is what is being called data externalities or horizontal consequences of data sharing. And this is not theoretical. This study that I show here actually took user data from a now defunct social media site, I think it was MySpace. And by using data analytics, it managed to uncover the sexual orientation of people that were not even members of that social network, what is being called shadow profiles. So let that sink in. You might not share anything. You might be one of the few people that resist joining those networks. And just because people that you know, your friends or relatives, do that, we now have the capacity to uncover intimate information about you. So that, to me, breaks this whole kind of autonomy and information asymmetries narrative, which is the first criticism of control and where the main focus has been so far. A second line of criticism that gets us closer to this, but not all the way, is the social value of privacy, right? So we say that because individuals derive benefits from having privacy, society as a whole derives benefits as well. For example, we want citizens to have privacy to form their opinions so that they can be good citizens, for example. But both these criticisms still remain within the individualistic framework of privacy. So we see privacy as an individual right, which might be good for individuals, and it might be good as it stands for society as well. Well, there's a third conception, which is sees privacy as a public good. Now, a public good in economics has two characteristics. It's non-rival, which means that my enjoyment of the good does not reduce your capacity to enjoy it. And it's not exclusive, which means that you cannot exclude anyone from enjoying that good. Now, if I withhold information, if I don't disclose it to a data controller, that means that both my privacy and your privacy is increased. And that is non-rival because, like, my enjoyment of the increased privacy does not diminish your capacity to enjoy the increased privacy. And it's also not exclusive because if I do not disclose, that means you're going to have increased privacy as well. I cannot prevent you from enjoying that good. Now, the problem with public goods in economic theory is that it's a traditional instance of market failure. Not because individuals have bad intentions, but they have an incentive to free ride on the public good. To make it a bit more concrete, I have an incentive to disclose my data because if I don't, I will still have less privacy because everyone else is doing it. And I will be deprived of the access to apps and websites and all those good things we get by giving away our data. So if I am a rational and informed actor, which is what we are supposed to be striving for, I will actually make decisions that will reduce my privacy, not that decisions that will enhance it. And that's why I'm saying that the whole information asymmetries debate is a bit misplaced, because that's not the biggest problem here, actually. So there are two questions. The first one is that we need to limit control and we need to limit individual rights, or abolish them, some people say, entirely. So to what extent should we do that to safeguard privacy? And how do we reconcile that with Article 8 of the Charter? Because data protection, privacy are fundamental rights. So there is a legal problem on top of that as well. And I will address these two questions as I make the case for control without consent. Now, the current model that we have in the GDPR is a bit combined. So we have individual rights that exist both at the stage of data collection and the data processing, so throughout. And those rights can be used to increase our privacy, for example, by exercising my right to erasure, or they can be used to decrease it if I give consent to some data processing. And we have collective principles that are not dependent on the will of the individual, which also cover the entirety of the data processing. But we have no rule that prevents an individual to disclose. We have rules that, for example, make sure that the consent is valid and there is no manipulation and so forth. But if I am fully informed, fully rational, everything that the data controller does is right, and I disclose my data, there is nothing preventing me from doing so, despite the fact that my action will have a negative effect on others through data externalities. So what I am suggesting is that we should abolish consent to address this problem, but retain individual rights in a way that can only increase but not decrease privacy. And then we should have collective rules that cover the entirety of the processing and that address these externalities. And I'm not saying having externalities is necessarily always a bad thing. I mean, it is a bad thing, but in the overall balance of things, it might be beneficial that we're going to impose some costs on people because the benefits we get are greater. But we cannot do this through an individual-based system. We need something more collective, because otherwise people will free ride. They will face this prisoner's dilemma kind of situation, and we will have suboptimal protection of the good in question, in this case, privacy. So what are the advantages of this approach? The first one, I think, is that it is a more feasible solution than abolishing rights entirely, both politically, because running on a platform that says no rights for the people is not going to be very, very salient with voters, I guess. And legally, and here I'm going to address the Article 8 question, because I looked at the Charter, and the mention in Article 8 is that you can have consent or another lawful basis. Now the question is, does that mean you need to have consent on something else, or does that mean that you can have other lawful bases entirely on their own? And I think there is no definite legal answer to be found there, but I think we can overcome the problem in this way. We can obviously not allow consent to exist when we have data externalities, because then it's not a question of autonomy, you're simply harming other people. And I have talked with data scientists, and there is great doubt if there are any data points at all that can produce no such externalities. And even if we have some data points that do not produce externalities this day, the development of technology may mean that they will produce such externalities in the future. So if we have a risk-based approach, the instances where consent can be exercised without having externalities are very few, especially if you impose the burden on the controller to demonstrate that no such externalities are to be found. And then if we combine that with a rigorous enforcement of the standards that the GDPR sets for consent, which are in practice very rarely met, I think even if we nominally retain consent, effectively it will have a very marginal role, and that would be a good thing. And the second, I think, very important advantage is that in this way we will enhance political accountability. Because, for example, if you follow the debate on online behavioral advertising, a lot of politicians do not defend these practices in principle. They don't say it's good to have, for example, surveillance capitalism. They say, we want people to make the decisions, even though everyone knows that people are not actually making those decisions. And it acts as a fig leaf that prevents politicians from taking accountability for what they allow and what they don't. So I think if we get rid of consent, we could actually have an improvement in political accountability, and then politicians would have to put a positive argument forward of why allow this practice or not, and it will foster public debate on these issues. Now, what are some potential objections to such an approach? The first one, and the obvious one, is that it could be seen as paternalistic, it could be seen as depriving of individual autonomy. And I think that argument doesn't carry much weight, because we all know the difficulties that the individuals face in making such decisions, which are very rarely meaningful. But if we also see it in the context of the horizontal relationships and the data externalities, even a pure liberal theorist would agree that you do not have the freedom to impose harms on others. Like, that's what John Stuart Mills famously said. So I think that the argument doesn't carry much water. And the second potential objection, especially from the industry, could be that if you remove this, you could harm the business model, you could deprive the data from their economic value. But I don't think that is true, because if you take away consent and you have some rules that allow or not allow data processing, those rules can be anything. So if we want to let companies exploit data in a certain way or not, we can still do it. There is nothing preventing us from doing so. What will be the important improvement, in my opinion, is that then you won't rely on the smokescreen of leaving the decision up to individuals, but you will actually have to bear the burden of making an active and informed decision as a lawmaker, and then facing the consequences for that decision. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. thank you for this kind of provocative thesis. When I look at the topic of your presentation, I was kind of scared at the beginning because the proposal to abolish or restrict consent is quite scary, especially when we take into account GDPR. But I will stop here and let's take some questions from the audience. Are there any questions, remarks, feedback about this theoretical proposal? Can you please take the mic?
Hello. So my question refers to what you said about the complete freedom to consent. And I was wondering if you took into consideration the data quality principles, right? Because you cannot consent to processing that is unfair. And then there's also the purpose limitation principle, data minimization, and the rest can go on. So don't you think that these are enough controls in limiting the individual choice?
Are we collecting some more?
Yeah, are there more questions? Yes, please.
Thank you so much for this presentation, which was very interesting. My question was whether under the GDPR, you mentioned like the collective rules, which it was very interesting, whether you think that under the GDPR, there is like legal basis for that, or at least something. Thank you so much.
Hi, maybe adding up into that point, actually. I'm working more or less in the same domain, but from the other perspective, and I could challenge you in that regard. For instance, one thing that you said. So based on the relationality, it doesn't necessarily mean that if we increase the protection of privacy for one, it would mean the same for the other, especially in the context of genetics or health data, where like right to know, right not to know, or like that I have an interest to know about what is happening with that data. So that is the challenging part. And the second part is what I couldn't really understand. What is your exact proposal? Because it's nice to have this theory based on necessarily like, mostly from the US-based authors, that yeah, we can have these like collective approaches in data protection. But when you try to enforce them in the existing EU data protection framework, it doesn't really go in the way that we are envisaging on paper. So that's why I wanted to learn more about like what is your exact proposal when we say that, okay, we should abolish or we could abolish consent, but it's not the only legal ground. And did you check, for instance, maybe other mechanisms in the data protection framework that could actually give life to your suggestions?
Okay.
Thank you. Yep.
Great, thanks. I think it's useful, actually, what you mentioned about genetic data with regards to the two previous questions, because that is a traditional case where you have these externalities, some people call them privacy dependencies and so forth. And if you look at both the academic discourse and the regulatory discourse on genetic data, there is really no good answer to be found in the existing legal framework of the GDPR to address the effects on the third parties. There was some discussion of considering I mean, even with regard to the concept of data controller and data subject, what do you consider the third parties? Are they data subject that is not really workable, but they are really also not data controllers? So, I mean, the principles can help with regard to the vertical framework, but at least in my view, I do not see how they can address the externalities, the horizontal relationship. And I know that some people try to do some creative interpretation, but I think it's marginal at best, and I don't think it's a coherent framework to address the problem. Now, what you said about the American proposals and that they might not be reconcilable with the existing framework, that is true. But I do not necessarily think that the existing framework is the solution, and perhaps we should look beyond the GDPR. I think especially the proposals by Neil Richards and Woodrow Hartzog, who presented the other day here, are a very promising start to introduce duties of loyalty and fiduciary duties. Now, would that be irreconcilable with the GDPR? Potentially. But I don't think that is, the GDPR is not the end of the world. And I mean, if you have any concrete ideas about how we could tackle those data externalities through the GDPR, I would be very interested in discussing about it later. But in my view, I don't see it happening. It's just conceptually inadept to tackle these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's move to the second presentation, and this paper will be presented by Merel Noorman. She's an assistant professor in AI robotics at Tilburg University. She focuses on governance and regulation of AI and robotics, in particular on the responsible development and deployment and the relation between AI and democracy. She receives her PhD from Maastricht University, and she also works as an advisor for the Dutch Council for Social Development.
Thank you. Let me put my glasses on. I can actually see everyone. Hi. Yes, here's my presentation. Let me figure this one out. That's the problem with aging eyes. My glasses don't work anymore. Anyway, so I'll be presenting a paper that I wrote with my colleague Swierstra, Professor Swierstra at, or I should say former colleague at Maastricht University. Nowadays I work in Tilburg, so, but this comes from a project that we've worked on together. He is unfortunately not here today. So, that's the wrong one, sorry. This is the right one. Yes, okay. So one of the things that made me think about democratizing AI was a presentation I saw by the chief decision scientist, I think, Cassie, I forgot her name already, sorry about that. She was chief decision scientist at Google, and she talked about democratizing AI in terms of a microwave. So a microwave is this black box, off-the-shelf, easy-to-use appliance that can do things for us so that we don't have to think about how to do it, how to operate it. You just push a button and it cooks things for you. So it helps you to cook and do the things that you want to do. That's how she described what their plans were for AI technologies at Google. They make the appliances, you don't have to think about it, you just plug and play and work with it. The idea being that in this way, more people would have access to this technology and be able to leverage the power of these powerful technologies. And so in that way, it would democratize AI. And this is a more common way of describing democratizing AI. For instance, the Microsoft chairman described their collaboration with OpenAI in terms of democratizing AI. They would democratize AI in the sense that they would offer a new technological platform, again, similar to Google, where they would enable people, developers, organizations, etc., to have access to the best AI infrastructure models and tool chains that happen to be on a Microsoft platform. Now this seems a bit counterintuitive to what I think, and I think most people think about when they think about democracy, right? Democracy has something to do with having control over the decisions that are affecting you. And if we delegate decisions to these new powerful technologies that are on the platforms of big corporate company over big global companies, then we don't only delegate these decisions, but we also delegate control to these third parties without seeing what happens to that. So the idea of democracy or democratizing AI being about making it more accessible is somewhat counterintuitive, especially coming from these global companies. And there are other people that have also said, well, there's different ways we can think about democratizing AI. So for instance, Bouman and Fiesler talk about deep learning meets deep democracy, and they argue for more deliberative control processes around the development and use of technologies. But is that what we mean by democratizing AI? Is it about facilitating more deliberation and participation? Is it about creating more access to these technologies? Is it about majority rule? What is the democracy that we're talking about when we're talking about democratizing AI? And also, why do we need to democratize AI? And I think in this room, I can be quick here. One thing why we want to, or why we're talking about democratizing AI is that AI is is political. It enables you to exert force or power on, sorry, not always force, but power on people and make them do things that you want them to do or not do. So, and that's like most technologies. Technologies allow you to exert power. It allows you to change the world in ways that you want it to change, right? So this is not new, but AI creates new opportunities to do this. Through its affordances, AI can make people do things or not do things, and how they do that is decided by the people that develop and deploy them, right? So in that sense, they are in that sense, they are value laden. The people developing them, the people deploying them, have an idea about how they want to use or how they want to change the world through these technologies. So they have values embedded in them. And these values may conflict. We don't always agree with how these technologies should change the world or the environment or society or whatever. Now, this becomes a particular concern when the decisions that we're delegating to these technologies have collectively binding effects. And in the area that I'm studying now, this happens quite often. I'm looking at energy networks and AI in energy networks. And even things like having AI coordinate how electricity is shared between people, or how, whether or when solar panels need to be shut off because it's a sunny day and everyone's generating energy and nobody's taking energy. How to do that has collectively binding effects. You're affected by it whether you have solar panels on your roof or not, because it will affect your household. So in these cases, we tend to say in democratic society, if it affects us and we can't really get away from it easily, then we should have a say about it in one way or another. Now, you see this, like I said, in particular in energy networks. You see it also on social media, etc. But I happen to look at energy networks, and you see renewable energy communities, for instance. These are these new communities that Europe is promoting in order to facilitate the energy transition. If we can get people in a community to share energy with each other, then we can maintain the capacity of the grid, or make sure that we don't overload the grid. And so hopefully we can, accelerate and facilitate the energy transition in this way. But it also makes it a whole lot more complex, because we're decentralizing these coordination mechanisms and control mechanisms to the local level, and you want to share things between people, and you have all these new renewable energy sources, solar panels, wind panels, that have a dynamic that or that the current grid is not really built or designed for. So how do we do that? Well, we can use AI to do that. But in doing so, we are delegating decisions to these technologies. For instance, how to prioritize charging of communal batteries, or when to charge or discharge electrical vehicles within a community, or when to curtail solar panels on sunny days. Now, that makes us think, okay, so what are we talking about when we want to democratize how these AI technologies do all this, right? And we, in this paper, built on a framework developed by Mark Warren in 2016. I should check my time. I have no idea how long I've been talking. He offers a problem-based approach to democracy. He doesn't give one model of, like, look, this is how democracy should work, right? You have, it's for instance, deliberative democracy. Everyone should participate as much as possible. That's not what he presents. He says you can have different kinds of democracy, and it kind of depends on, the political system or the social system that you implement it in how well it works. But he says any political system should fulfill at least 3 functions. it should empower inclusion, it should enable collective will formation, and it should enable collective decision making. If it does that, then it's, you can call it democratic. So empowered inclusion is what is needed to have those part of the community be part of the democratic processes. So this can mean something like you have citizen rights and you have the right to vote. This is empowered inclusion. Collective will formation is going from individual preferences and desires in some way to form a collective agenda that we agree upon and that we have to discuss. And then if we have these collective agendas and points that we want to, or that we deliberate on or that we negotiate on, then how do we go from those negotiations to actual decisions, right? So voting might be a way of doing that, but it can also be consensus or whatever. And once you've made that decision, they should also be implemented, and people should uphold those decisions, even if it's not really what they want, right? So how do we organize these three functions? Well, Warren says we have 7 general practices or generic practices that can help us do that. So there's recognizing, resisting, deliberating, voting, representing, joining, and exiting. I'm not going to discuss all of them. I'm sure you can think of some examples, but just to give you an idea, recognizing means what are the practices that we have that allow us to see other people as part of our community and as equally justified to have a say in the processes or in the decision-making processes that we collectively uphold. Now, practice here is a key word. It's very important in this approach. And Warren defines practices as particular routinized social actions, such as socially intended behaviors, and encompasses formal and informal activities and mechanisms, norms, duties, and obligations, roles, etc. Now, notice that he doesn't mention technology here. And that's something that I'll come back to in a minute. So these political practices that I just noticed can help to implement these 3 functions, but they have their weaknesses and their strengths. So it's a balancing act of how we organize these to make a political system democratic. So for instance, resistance is very important to democracy, but too much of it or one party resisting too much can actually break democratic practices. So it's a balancing act. Now, what can we do with this framework sketched out by Warren? Well, we can assess the different proposals to democratize AI. So, for instance, if we look at the accessibility understanding presented by Google, for instance, that's a very thin understanding of democratizing AI. It says very little about deliberation. It says nothing about resistance. So it focuses mostly on perhaps recognizing or empowered inclusion, that we enable people to have access to these technologies. But it's not enough, right? So then we can ask the question, and Warren gives us different perspectives on how we can look at democratize. But should we democratize AI then? That's the second question. Well, Emmanouil wrote this interesting paper called Against Democratizing AI, very interesting. And he says, well, basically, it's a misplaced solution to concerns about fairness and accountability and justice. We don't need to democratize AI. He says democratizing is a response to systems that trigger legitimization requirements. So a system triggers such requirements when it leads to coercion, its decisions have a pervasive impact, remember, collectively binding decisions, and it involves schemes of social cooperation. Emmanouil says AI doesn't trigger such requirements. And it doesn't trigger these requirements because it's not, we should see AI as part of a social system. It's the system in which these technologies are embedded that triggers these requirements, right? So the AI in the renewable energy community is not triggering the requirements for legitimization. It's how this community together collectively decides how to distribute energy amongst themselves in this community. So he also said, so that's why we don't need to democratize AI, rather we need to democratize these systems, and we already have institutions in place to do this. We have laws, we have standardizations, and these are the things that we need to look at in order to govern AI.
Merel, you have -3 minutes left.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, shit. Okay, I'll finish. Okay. Sorry, I wasn't looking at your wave. Okay, so what Himmelreich doesn't look at is what he forgets is that AI plays a role in these practices, these political practices. Warren doesn't talk about technology, but if we take a sociotechnical perspective, then we recognize that AI shapes these practices. It mediates and gives form to how these practices cooperate. So what Warren then gives us is a lens through which we can see how we design technology in order to be supporting better political practices in terms of recognition or resistance or those kinds of things. And I'm sorry, I can't go over all of them, but it gives us questions to ask, for instance, in terms of empowerment inclusions. How can we improve recognition and representation? Well, that's one that speaks to, inclusive design, but also how can we make sure that the technologies we develop are still open to resistance. Once we have implemented them, can we still object to the decisions we make, and how do we make that? So that gives us a context in which we can think about transparency and explainability and accountability, etc. Now, when I was preparing this presentation, I was thinking OpenAI had this accessibility idea of democracy, but since yesterday they have an expanded view of democracy. I just learned about this today, but they have a call out for people to submit their ideas about how to democratize AI. And here they see a democratic process as a way in which a broadly representative group of people exchange opinions, engage in deliberative discussions, and ultimately decide on an outcome via transparent decision-making processes. So this already moves a little bit to the 3 functions of Warren. But if you then look at what how they describe it, you see they focus very much on the processes and how AI, for instance, can support deliberative processes rather than have people actually be involved in the decision-making that these technologies are delegated. I'll keep it at that.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you
I'm
so much.
sorry for running over time.
I'm really glad that you bring this the democratization idea, the concept to AI, because we heard a lot about regulating AI at this CPDP conference. We have time for only one question, I think. So anyone wants to ask a question, comment, feedback, please.
Is there? Am I audible to everybody? Okay, hi, Wes Damon, Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Thanks, Merel, lovely presentation. I was looking forward to the slides because last night you said you were still going to have to make them, so compliments to that. I was wondering, you mentioned the Warren framework for democracy. Yeah. However, constitutional lawyers, of course, amongst themselves have tons and tons of different definitions what democracy is, and they don't agree on any of this. So what would you, so I would just imagine, okay, Warren, that framework, if we apply it to certain AI systems, you get a certain output. You say, okay, this doesn't work because this isn't collective, this isn't, well, etc. But then if you would use another definition of democracy, maybe you get a different outcome to that analysis. So to make it even more abstract, how would you maneuver those situations where you can say, oh, actually, if we use this definition of democracy, it is sort of 80% okay, but if we use this one, it's not as okay? How would you envision such a scenario to play out? What to do with that? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. So I think Warren actually wrote the paper to sidestep the whole discussion about what's the best form of democracy. Because indeed, there are so many, it's an ongoing discussion, and there are so many different definitions of democracy. And he's decided to sidestep it and just look at, if you are building institutions or establishing new social relationships between people, how can you best do that? And that's why he talks about these three functions that should at least be catered to. So you should have empowered inclusion, and you should have collective will formation, and you should have collective decision making. And to what extent or how the percentage to which you succeed in that's, I guess, more an empirical question rather than a philosophical question. That's the best democracy if we all do all these things. But using Warren, you can say, look, this only works for the entitled few because you don't have enough. The practices, the recognition practices that you have established don't allow for many other people to be involved in decision making, or in collective will formation, for instance. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Errol Balsa. He's a postdoctoral research fellow at Cornell Tech. He works on privacy engineering, and he focuses on the design, analysis, and deployment of privacy-enhancing technologies, and in particular, the interplay between privacy engineering and policy. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Oh, wait. Thank you, Nina, for the introduction. So yes, Nina mentioned I'm Errol Balsa. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Cornell Tech, and today I'm going to briefly present work together with Helen Nissenbaum. So our work is largely a reflection on the role, assumptions, and hopes around privacy risk assessments. And that reflection is largely based on an examination of previous literature, but also on going really deep and step-by-step on one particular risk assessment methodology, the one that NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US, published at the beginning of 2020. But because I only have like around 10, 12 minutes to present this work today, and I also want to leave plenty of room for questions, I cannot give you a detailed overview of that analysis, how we went step by step. So instead, I'm just going to give you like briefly the motivation and genesis of this project, and then kind of try to jump straight into the takeaways. Also, when I say takeaways, these are by no means final. I should emphasize that this is an ongoing project, this is work in progress, and so this is not meant to be read as a conclusion or a verdict on privacy risk assessments. Rather, I hope that we can actually have a brief conversation about this, and that your feedback actually helps us move this project forward, much like the reviewers actually helped us improve the paper already. So, as I said, this project started as a reflection on what it would take for companies to adopt privacy-enhancing technologies. And this reflection led us to privacy risk assessments. We asked, would privacy risk assessments encourage or promote the adoption of privacy-enhancing technologies? And if so, how? And the short answer is no, or not necessarily, and there's a number of reasons for that. And by the way, I should probably, I should briefly talk about terminology. I refer, and I will be referring to privacy risk assessments as a subset of privacy impact assessments, in that privacy risk assessments perform this explicit computation of risk, defined as the product between the likelihood or probability of some privacy harm and the impact or magnitude of that harm. Whereas privacy impact assessments do not necessarily make that explicit calculation, even if some informal risk calculation of sorts must implicitly take place. But of course, this terminology is by no means a standard or universal. Anyway, so when we looked at the literature on privacy risk assessments and the broader tradition of privacy impact assessments in which they are embedded, we found a number of assumptions or desiderata, and I want to highlight two main points today. One there's this idea that privacy risk assessments should be conducted in a principled and systematic way. There's this desire or hope for objectivity. And in that, if two different people were to perform a privacy impact assessment independently, they should arrive at the same outcome or conclusion. And that would mean that the methodology is truly objective, scientific even. And this actually fits into a technocratic narrative where risk assessments are folded into engineering practice, much like NIST does. So they become simply a technical assessment that any engineer following the protocol should be able to perform, invariably arriving at the right outcome. Then the second is the role of privacy risk assessments in a particular mode of governance in which they are embedded. And this is one that other authors have variously referred to as monitor self-regulation, binary governance, meta-regulation, or co-regulation. And here the key idea is that the regulator takes a very light approach, asking organizations to assess risk themselves, while keeping them accountable through, let's say, occasional audits. Now, note how these two assumptions actually interact with each other. If a privacy risk assessment is objective, organizations simply have to follow the process and should invariably get to the right answer. So it's rather safe and easy for the regulator to ask them to do so and then simply verify that they just followed the protocol or they just followed the process correctly, as expected. If, on the other hand, privacy risk assessments are performed in this arbitrary and inconsistent way, then it will be easier for organizations to cheat, in part because it would be so much harder for the regulator to actually audit them and verify the assessment and hold them accountable. And interestingly, during this panel of algorithmic impact assessments that I attended yesterday, I asked the panelists, all of which were performing algorithmic impact assessments in practice and were using their own guidelines and processes, whether they could, or whether there was any claim to objectivity. Whether they thought that if they had two different teams performing or following their guidelines and performing these assessments independently, they would actually get to the same outcomes and they would get to the same conclusions. Or whether, instead, the outcome would very much depend on their own perspective and their own politics and their own practice. And what was interesting is that one of the speakers assured me that their methodology was very much 100% objective, or very close to that. So that their methodology would lead to replicable results if two teams were to follow it independently. The other speaker, on the other hand, said that it was 100% subjective. And so you could think that either one of them was wrong or that both of them were. And I actually think that both of them are right, but only because the claim of objectivity is about two different things. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So the one that's at 100% subjective acknowledges that the particular impact of risk assessment that we select is in essence political, because it considers certain harms and ignores others, sets a certain threshold for which harms are registered and which ones aren't, defines the system under examination in a more or less capacious way, makes certain assumptions about how harms interact with each other, and also makes decisions about which secondary harms we would be interested in examining. Not to mention that harms themselves are pretty much subjective. And that's precisely what we saw in our analysis of the NIST's privacy risk assessment methodology. There's all these, and we're borrowing here terminology from Ben Green, there's all these sites of discretion in the methodology that actually adversarial organizations that don't have a privacy interest as a priority might actually tune and weaponize in order to come up with a risk assessment of their choice to legitimize their own practices. So they could actually tweak all these parameters in order to arrive at a computation of risk that is low enough so that they can say, see, the risk is low, so we should be doing this. This shouldn't be a concern. And so, because these organizations can tune and strategically select how they tune these parameters, we could confidently say that the estimation of risk cannot be considered in any way objective. Now, the second speaker from yesterday's panel, however, said that once we have defined and agreed on all of these subjective parameters and variables, and we do that somehow by reaching a working consensus, pinning them down to go past that subjectivity, we can actually perform an objective assessment. So the measuring part in itself might be objective. It is the selection of assessment methodology or the parameters of that methodology that is subjective, and that is essentially political. Now, the problem is that either in selecting our very concrete privacy assessment methodology or implementing a vague methodology like the one from NIST, there are all these sides of discretion, again, that adversarial organizations are going to weaponize to essentially rig the assessment and ultimately legitimize their practices. And unlike security, privacy is not necessarily aligned with an organization's incentives, particularly when these organizations are involved in the business of monetizing data, user data. And so the claim of objectivity seems to be kind of doomed from the start. And not only that, but this also becomes an auditing nightmare because for the regulator, without having like a particular process that all of these organizations might agree on or have a consensus around, it's very hard to actually do this process all over again for each of these organizations. Even if at the same time, it is also true that because of the very contextual nature of privacy, at the end of the day, we need to actually have very specific privacy risk assessments for each particular situation. So just to wrap up and jump into to two of the main takeaways that I would like to make today. First, I would say that we need to be far more cautious and skeptical about organizations doing these privacy risk assessments. Maybe this is a job for third parties altogether, and we shouldn't expect adversarial companies to do this properly. And this is very much in the same way that we don't just trust and expect mining companies to perform environmental impact assessments. We also shouldn't give free rein to organizations to choose many of these parameters, to choose their own scale, to choose their own definition of privacy, to choose how they actually capture the system under evaluation, who the users are, who might be affected. All of these parameters shouldn't just be like freely chosen by the organization. Which is actually what with the privacy risk assessment methodology of NIST does. This is essentially a recipe for disaster. And second, perhaps we should actually work towards a consensus on what to assess and how to assess this, and establish clear, lower level guidelines that cannot be as arbitrarily interpreted and that don't have as many sides of discretion. And this is actually very much unlike the existing set of guidelines, which are all very like high level and vague, and for a good reason, because they want to be applicable to a very wide range of scenarios. But at the end of the day, again, they end up leaving a lot of room for manipulating this. And I think that I'm just going to end here, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. Let's take some questions. Yes.
Can I start? Hi, Bettina Behrendt, TU Berlin, Weizenbaum Institute in KU Leuven. Everyone knows me. And I have two questions. The first would be, this reminds me very much of work that's been done at the moment in data documentation. And it's good that there's a lot of social scientists there, because any social scientist would tell you that the search for a process that's objective and replicable in this sense, that's a straw man that some engineers might invent in order to tear him down. I mean, anyone working with qualitative methods knows that if you apply that same method and in a different setting and so on, something else might come out. The important bit is not to have that checklist and believe that this is going to give you engineering type objectivity, but to have a reflective process that allows other people to understand step by step what you did, and then to contest it. And so I don't really understand this surprise. I mean, it's good that you point it out, because this needs to be pointed out again and again, but is it really surprising? that this is not objective in the engineering sense of the word and cannot be.
Well,
and the second question, maybe that I'll just say that because you might roll it into it, I don't know. The NIST framework is certainly one that's been used a lot in the States, and there are other frameworks. Maybe you could say a few words about them. Maybe they're doing a better job.
No, I don't think so. So is it surprising? That's the first question. Well, if you actually look at the literature on privacy risk assessments, there is this like recurrent theme of we need to be objective, we need to be replicable. This is like the utopian goal towards which we are striving, so that we can again. This is implicit in the whole narrative, right? Like we can just let organizations do it, and they will just follow the process, and they will arrive at the right outcome and inclusion, because it's just perfectly rational. There is no room for subjectivity. That is kind of like, if you look at the literature on privacy impact assessments, that is like an overarching and recurrent theme that comes over and over and over again. And I think it also like informs a lot of these efforts on trying to come up with, you know, the best guidelines or the more appropriate guidelines and so on and so forth. So is it so surprising? No, but it's still like that goal is very much pervasive in the literature. And then I would say, so we actually didn't go in depth in the same way that we went for NIST, but actually taking a look, like a course look at some of the other guidelines, such as CNIL and I think the ISO one, they're all the same. I mean, there's all this vagueness that you could just like take the guidelines and interpret in a million different ways, in such a way that you could actually just fit whatever kind of analysis and assessment you come up with and just fit it there and say, I did it, and this is what came out. And so depending on how you actually choose all those variables, again, like how you define this system, like you could actually define the system as in like the particular like organization that you actually control. For instance, like one of the examples that we use in the paper is, think about a website, a news publisher, right? Such as, I don't know, like the New York Times. So if the New York Times were to be assessing the risk of running like targeted advertising, the New York Times could say, well, you know, what is the data that we actually collect about users and that we use for advertising? But that actually is one conceptualization of the system. The other conceptualization of the system would be, well, what happens with the whole network of advertising to which we're actually just like contributing like a small part? How do you actually, like, though, you know, depending on what your view of the system is, those are actually completely different.
If I may interrupt here to take follow-ups for the coffee break, because we have only one presentation left and we are running out of time, okay? If it's, yes?
Okay, I'm just saying this is dangerous because if we have always the opposition 100% objective or 100% subjective, then we're not getting anywhere. I think that's really important to counteract that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's the point that we're trying to make. And if that's the point that seems to come across from this, that's not what I was trying to say.
Thank you so much. I'm pressing the time because finally I'm extremely happy to introduce Asuman Senol. She is the first author of the winning paper of the CNIL INRIA Privacy Protection Award. And she is privacy researcher at the Computer Science Security and Industrial Cryptography at Leuven. And she is doing her PhD under supervision of Guinness Akar and Claudia Diaz. So congratulations for the winning paper. I see at the audience co-authors. Guinness Akar is somewhere, yes, he's somewhere, yes, here. And Frederick Zuderwin Borgesius, yes. Congratulations, and the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. First of all, I would like to thank you all for attending today's presentation. I'm Asuman, and today I would like to give a talk about our latest study, which is leaky forms. In this study, I worked together with Güneş Acar, Matthias Humbert, and Frederick Zuderwin Borgesius. Before going into details, first I would like to talk about online tracking. Online tracking enables companies to build behavioral profiles of the users. Since nowadays, most of the companies provide their services on different platforms, such as web, or native mobile applications. tracking users on these different platforms became crucial for effective profiling. On the other hand, major browser vendors such as Mozilla and Google decided to block or partition third-party cookie usage. That's why reliance on alternative approach increased in a few last years. And since our email addresses are unique and persistent identifiers on the web, tracking users via email addresses became an alternative approach for both cross-site and cross-platform tracking. And the demand for a more global and persistent identifier, along with the ongoing third-party cookie phase-out, makes our email addresses an attractive target for the tracker domains. However, the prior works on personal data exfiltrations from online forms was limited. Besides, personal data collections from online forms before form submission has been less studied. Only in 2017, two writers reported that a third party, which is Naviston, was collecting personal data from a mortgage calculator website before form submission. Actually, this form abandonment is not uncommon as most of us expected. According to a 2018 survey, 59% of the respondents abandoned a form in the last month. With this motivation, we aim to measure email and password exfiltrations from online forms before form submission. We also checked effect of location, effect of cookie consent choices, and lastly, we compared mobile and desktop crawl results. To simulate user typing behavior and collect data for analysis, we extended Tracker Radar Collector, which is a web crawler developed by DuckDuckGo. Actually, detecting password fields is easier than detecting email fields because password fields can be created only using input type password elements. However, email fields can be created by using input type text fields, input type email fields. That's why it was more tricky to detect email fields. And to tackle this issue, we used a pre-trained email classifier of Mozilla. And in this way, we detected 60% more email fields than simply searching input type email fields. And in addition to that, to check the effect of cookie consent choices, we needed to interact with the cookie consent banners. And to interact with the cookie consent banners, we used a browser extension, which is Consentomatic. And by using this extension, we only detected cookie consent banners on approximately 7% of the website. So it's not a comprehensive tool, but this is the only tool for accepting and rejecting. And in this study, we run 8 crawls from 2 different locations with 3 consent modes: no action, accept all, and reject all. In the end of this study, we visited more than 2.8 million web pages. And to filter legitimate usage of email collections, such as email validation, etc., we use different block lists, such as EasyList and EasyPrivacy. So we only considered requests to the tracker domains. And in addition to these block lists, we also manually labeled some tracker domains. And thanks to this manual labeling effort, we discovered 41 unlisted tracker domains, and we already reported those domains to the block list providers. And with this study, we detected email collection on more than 1,800 distinct websites in the EU, and the numbers is higher in the US. We detected 2,950 distinct websites, email collection on that many websites in the US. And in addition to those email collections, we also discovered incidental passwords collection on approximately 50 websites, both in EU and US. And this table shows the most prominent tracker domains. In the EU, we see Taboola on the high, And Taboola is an advertisement company that provides clickbait and other problematic type contents. And according to their documentation, they accept hashed email addresses to show targeted advertisements to their users. On the other hand, in the US, rlcdn.com dominates the table. And according to their help page, unlike click and submit events, blur event does not require human interaction to collect data. So while you are typing your data to the online forms, rlcdn.com can collect your data when the focus is lost. This table shows the top 10 websites. Newspaper websites such as USA Today, Independent Co. UK, Newsweek.com appear high in this list. And we know from recent studies there are more trackers on the newspaper websites. And Headline.com, WebMD.com are other notable entries in this table with their sensitive content. Top 3 categories are fashion and beauty, online shopping, and general list, where we detected email collection most. Although we filled our email addresses on hundreds of websites, we didn't see any single leak on adult websites, as you can see here. Now I want to compare EU and US crawl results. As I said before, we detected email collection in the US on 60% more websites, and some tracker domains such as yahoo.com, doubleclick.net, criteo.com only appear in the US crawl results. Although we didn't submit any form in this study, we received 290 emails from 88 distinct websites. Since we used distinct emails in each website, we were able to attribute which emails is coming from which domain. Some of the companies invited us back to their websites to complete the forms, as you can see in this screenshots. It's a sample email that we received, and some of the companies offered some discounts with those emails. As I said, we also discovered incidental passwords collections by mostly session replay services. Yandex Metrica collects users' passwords due to misconfiguration of React framework. And Yandex is a session replay service of Yandex Metrica is a session replay service of Yandex, and the other tracker domains that collect users' passwords are Mixpanel and LogRocket. We already reported all of those cases to the first parties and those tracker domains, and they fixed those issues. Now I want to quickly show on Toyota RU, Russian websites of Toyota, how they collect our passwords. While we are typing, as you can see here on the request, we see our passwords without submitting the form, by the way. With this study, we inspected email and passwords collection before form submission. However, what happens after our data arrives to third-party servers was unknown to us. To better understand server-side processing, we reach out both first parties and also third parties. For the websites that we detected email collection in the EU, we sent GDPR requests. And almost half of the first parties replied us. Some of them were not aware of the collection. For instance, 538.com, Trello.com. And when we reached them out, they removed those third-party scripts from their site. And Marriott taught us that they used a third party, which is Glassbox, for different purposes, such as customer care, technical support, and fraud prevention. Again, half of the third parties replied us. Adobe and Yandex suggested us to send our GDP request to the first parties, not the third parties. And Taboola told us that they use our email addresses for ad and content personalization. And for the websites that we detected email collection in the US, we didn't send GDPR request. Instead, we sent a friendly notification about email collection. However, we couldn't get any response back from those websites. After Usenik submission, we closely looked at leaks to the Facebook domain, and while checking those leaks, we also discovered a lot of leaks to TikTok domain as well. I know most of the people know TikTok as a video platform, but they also have a pixel product to track users online. Both of these platforms, Facebook and TikTok, have automatic advanced matching feature under their pixel product to collect hashed personal identifiers to track users and show targeted advertisements in the respective platforms. Unlike what they claimed on their documentation, we found that they collect hashed of personal identifiers before form submission. For instance, on the login form of UPS, you are typing your email address, but instead of submitting the form, you decided to check the, for instance, privacy policy. Now we are calculating the hash of our email address. When you click the privacy policy link, Facebook directly collects the hash of your email address. And similarly, on these child websites, while you are typing when you type your email address, and after just clicking this close button, now I'm calculating the hash of our email address again. After clicking that close button, TikTok directly collects hash of our email address. As I said before, we detected hash of email addresses collection by Facebook and TikTok on thousands of websites. And this is the elements that trigger the collection on this website, on independent CoUK. As you can see here, almost all the elements trigger that collection. As a countermeasure, we suggest using ad blockers, that kind of personal data exfiltrations from online forms, and users can also choose to use private email relay services. Mozilla and recently DuckDuckGo released their private relay services, email relay services. In this way, users can hide their actual email addresses. And however, when we check all these tools, we didn't see any comprehensive detection and prevention methods against those types of exfiltrations. That's why we developed a proof of concept browser add-on, which is Leaky Spectre. It can detect sniff attempts, means the scripts reads the input elements, they reads the personal data from the online forms, and our extension can also block requests containing any personal data. And this is some screenshots of our extension. In the extension, we list the tracker domains that attempts to sniff or collect the personal data. And we also highlight the input element where our personal data is collected from. And I want to quickly show how our extension works. For instance, while typing our email address, if any third-party script reads the input field or they collect our email address and send to their service, we highlight the input field, and also we show the tracker domains that collect and sniffs our personal data. To sum up, with this study, we detected email collection on thousands of websites, both in EU and the US. We also detected incidental password collection on approximately 50 websites, both in EU and US. We discovered 41 unlisted tracker domains, and we already reported those to the providers. And lastly, we developed a web extension, proof of concept web extension that can detect and block personal data exfiltrations from online forms. And we believe that both publishers and end users can investigate the third parties and tracker domains that can collect personal data from online forms without their consent and knowledge. That's all from my side. We also developed a project website, all the details about our study, including the data, links to our GitHub repositories, and some screenshots, screen captures can be found in our project website. And thanks a lot again. And if you have any questions, comments, please feel free to share.
Thank you so much. I know that we are out of time, but I just couldn't stop you, when you were...
Thank you so much. I noticed.
The results are real discoveries are really amazing and really scary at the same time. I think we can have one short question, really short one, if there is a need, and if not, we can ask some questions during the break. Yes. Yeah. Yes, please.
Sorry, super impressive, super scary. Thanks a lot. And I think this should not just be for 30 people, but this should have been in the grant one. Just a quick question. How can we irritate the system? So what is the counteracting? Can I first type in some kind of a stupid email, which is not really mine? Or what do I do?
Yeah, I mean, it's not... only email addresses, it's all the personal data can be collected. For the email addresses, as I said, you can use email relay services. It can be a way to protect, or ad blockers can help. But yeah, for now, we don't have a lot of tools against that. We also reach out some browser vendors, because browser vendors can do something against that kind of things. They can detect which third parties collects or sniffs the personal data from online forms, as we did in our extension. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
So thank you so much. Like a last sentence to conclude, maybe, that this session showed us that the importance of empirical research, but also to have some theoretical framework if we want to regulate technology. So I think it was a nice mixture from different standpoints, and thank you so much. I really enjoyed the session. And CPDP is coming to the end, and this is the last coffee break, to be honest. If you don't know, this is the last coffee break right now, so enjoy your coffee.